Okay, good evening, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Nola Hewitt-Dundas. I'm Pro-Vice-Chancellor of the Faculty of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences, and also Professor of Innovation Management and Policy. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight to the annual Queen's Business School President Mary McAleese Diversity Lecture, which is held in association with the Chief Executives Club. In particular, I want to extend a very special welcome to our guest speaker, Professor Jill Rubery, Professor of Comparative Employment Systems at the University of Manchester. Professor Rubery is an internationally recognised expert in the critique of employment systems and in particular issues around gender and labour market structure. I know I speak on behalf of everyone in the room when I say that we're greatly looking forward to you delivering the annual Mary McAleese Lecture, which now in its 6th year, which is incredible, honours the contribution of President McAleese to promote greater equality and diversity in society and in the workplace. At Queen's, equality, diversity and inclusion is something that we are fully committed to improving. It's an ongoing journey of continually challenging our structures, our processes, our behaviours and our biases to ensure that we not only are doing things right, but also that we are doing the right thing for every single employee, our stakeholders, and also in terms of the example that we as a university set for the wider society. At Queen's, this year represents 25 years since the first listening exercise to engage with women at all grades across the university, to try to understand their perceptions but also their lived experiences of gender inequality. This led to a portfolio of recommendations to address inequalities and the establishment in 1999 of the Women's Forum. Of course, much progress has been made since then in ensuring that we do have or give a voice to women, but also that we're embedding structures, culture, and working practices that are fair, they're transparent, and they are responsive to the needs of women. And while we were delighted in January this year to be the first university on the island of Ireland and only the second in the UK to achieve an institutional Athena Swan Charter Gold Award for our work in improving gender equality, well, much more work is required if we're to achieve gender equality in its truest form, as well as equality across other protected characteristics. Ultimately, Queen's, and in the context of tonight's lecture, the Business School, is committed to creating an inclusive future for all of our staff, aligned with Strategy 2030 and our core values. Just last week, Queen's had the pleasure of hosting the Global Innovation Summit that was held in collaboration with the Global Federation of Competitiveness Councils. And the theme of the conference was Accelerating Global Sustainability and Economic Inclusion. And over 3 days, we explored the connections that exist between economic performance, social inclusion, and environmental protection. These are themes that are as pertinent globally as they are locally, as evident in the priorities of government for the Department of the Economy, with Minister Conor Murphy emphasising good jobs to provide workers with a decent standard of living, regional balance to ensure equity of opportunity, irrespective of where you live, productivity to drive living standards, and the goal of reducing carbon emissions. Inclusivity is central to these priorities, ensuring that all individuals, irrespective of their background, can participate fully in society. With inclusivity, generating benefits for all, including the promotion of equity, justice, stronger economic growth, greater social cohesion, improved individual well-being, and greater political stability. It's no coincidence that the Nobel Prize in Economics both last year and this year were awarded to individuals who have sought to examine problems of a lack of inclusivity. Last year, Professor Claudia Goldin was honoured for her work to understand the determinants of the persistent gender gap in women's earnings and labour market outcomes. This year, 3 professors from America were awarded the Nobel laureate for their work on the relationship between institutions and prosperity. Briefly, their research demonstrated that societies with poor rule of law and institutions that exploit the population do not generate growth. The work of Professor Jill Rubery further contributes to our understanding of inclusivity, and we're delighted to have you with us this evening. Professor Rubery worked at the Department of Applied Economics at Cambridge University before moving in 1989 to Manchester, and is currently Executive Director of the Work and Equalities Institute at Alliance Manchester Business School, an institute that evolved from the European Work and Employment Centre, which she established in 1994, demonstrating that Jill has certainly been a pioneer in recognising the need to articulate and tackle issues of gender inequality. In 2006, she was elected a Fellow of the British Academy and an Emeritus Fellow of Murray Edwards College, University of Cambridge. Professor Rubery has researched and published widely on topics including labour market regulation policies, minimum wages, new forms of work and flexibility, women's employment and women's pay, employers' working time policies, and international comparative employment systems. Her insight has led to extensive engagement with the European Commission, where she coordinates the Gender and Employment Expert Group, and with the International Labour Organization. I can think of no one more experienced to deliver tonight's Mary McAleese lecture. So please join me in welcoming Professor Jill Rubery to deliver her lecture entitled Beyond a Focus on Gender Gaps, Why We Need More Egalitarian Labour Markets to Achieve Gender Equality. Professor Rubery.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. Just perhaps a few words on my sort of background. I'm not currently coordinating the Gender Employment Expert Group for the EU. I did that from 1991 to 2007. And that was really a very interesting experience of both getting involved in policy, but also learning about all the EU countries. I have to say, once I got to having to write reports on 30 countries with a 4-week window, I decided to give up. But yes, I have been very involved in both the comparative employment systems approach and on gender equality. So it's a great honour to have been asked to give this year's Mary McAleese Diversity Lecture. As somebody who comes from a business school, I think it's great that you have this commitment to a diversity lecture, and certainly it's something that we need to encourage in all business schools. As you've already heard, what I chose for my topic today was Beyond a Focus on Gender Gaps, or Why We Need More Egalitarian Labour Markets to Achieve Gender Equality. The reason for selecting this is I think as a society we've become a bit obsessed with measuring all gender equality issues by reference to gender gaps. I'm sure you've all heard saying it's going to take 50 years at this rate of progress to close the gender gap, etc. And that's how we sort of tend to measure whether we're making any progress. And I've got at least 3 reasons why that's not necessarily the case. I mean, first, women may be closing the gap with men because men's pay or employment is falling. But I'm not certain that that's great news for women. I mean, most women do live with men, form households with men, and actually just having lower household income doesn't make them feel that much better or more inclusive. Secondly, I think women may be closing the gap with men because some are moving up the career ladder, moving up the occupation hierarchy, and that sort of dominates. But we don't know what's happening to those left behind who are unlikely to move up the ladder and may be the people where conditions of work may be deteriorating and where they most need help. Third, and it's a related point, a key issue is whether we are only interested in closing the gap with men or only if that improves the overall level of equality in the labour market in our society. I mean, is it a good idea for women to move up to be replaced by a lot more, even more disadvantaged men, for example, exploited migrant workers and the like? Is that progress? Or do we actually need to think about improving the value and the conditions in the work that women are currently doing and not about them moving out of those jobs? Because many of those jobs are very valuable to society. Now, a very telling piece by two American economists, Francine Blau and Larry Kahn, found that it was useful to recognize that the aggregate gender pay gap stemmed from two very different causes. The first is how women are ranked relative to men in the labour market. And the second is, what's the penalty for having a lower rank? So women might have a lower average median position for men, but say they're 10% down the ranking. What does that mean in terms of the penalty? Do they get a 5%, 10%, 20% or 30% pay penalty for that difference in rank? And what they were sort of showing was that sometimes it might be better to be slightly lower ranked, but in a more equal society. And equally, in the case of the US, women at that point were possibly better ranked in the labour market overall than women in general, but because it was such an unequal labour market, there was a wider gender pay gap. So this suggests that we need to consider the overall inequality in the labour market and not simply look at men versus women in that sort of rather simplistic way. I mean, a good example here is that when women were closing the closing the gap in educational achievement with men. And for many years, people thought the real problem with women's gender pay gap was they didn't have as much human capital or education as men. But as soon as they started to close that gap, actually the rewards for having a degree started widening. So the goalposts were changing. And women have been, have not benefited to the extent that economists were predicting from closing that gender gap, because actually the actual widening inequalities in countries like the UK and the US amongst people with degrees. And the answer is not necessary to chase these higher pay that people at the top end, the graduate labour market, might be achieving. A good example, I think, if we come back to the BBC equal pay scandal that was a few years ago, the real question there was, amongst top-level presenters, the female top-level presenters were paid a lot less than the male presenters. But the real question we should have been asking, and I wasn't really asked that frequently, is it the case that the men are overpaid or the women underpaid? Now, I think at the top level, that's the right question to ask. Where it's not the right question to ask is in other contexts, particularly, for example, I don't know whether you've been following some of the equal pay issues of local authorities in the UK. The Birmingham local council is going bankrupt because it hasn't made sufficient provision for backdated equal pay claims. Now, I'm not defending the Birmingham City Council on this, but I don't think that it's up to male manual workers in Birmingham City Council to actually pay for the equal pay case that women have successfully won and should have won. Because the problem there is that the women are underpaid, not that the men are overpaid. and we haven't provided enough resources to local authorities to be able to fund those pay awards. They've been expected to fund them in large extent by reducing pay for those who are paid more than the women for the same kind of work. So where it's where it's not talking about the top level of pay, I think it's more important that we have a general commitment through taxation or whatever to fund the higher pay that many people in cleaning jobs, care work, retail jobs, etc. Do and are maybe underpaid relative to their value in the society. So what I'm arguing here is that therefore equality issues amongst women also need some attention. Tracy Warren, who's a sociologist now at Nottingham University Business School, and others have argued that debates on work-life balance have become too focused on issues of reducing time in paid work, and she sees that as mainly reflecting the interests of more middle-class women in professional jobs. But for many working-class women, their main concern may be inadequate income due to too few, not too many hours, too many guaranteed hours of work, as well as, of course, too low hourly wages. So the current debates about remote working, I think, are also falling into a similar trap. Flexibility is now seen as all about the right to work from home and not to have to return to the office, at least not full time. But we have to remember that the ONS recent statistics showed just the last week that 28% of workers, that's employees and self-employed combined, so a lot of self-employed will fall into this, are hybrid workers. They can work in the office or at home, and a further 13% work only at home. And again, a lot of those will be self-employed. So that leaves at least 60% and a higher share actually of employees who can't work or can't currently work from home or can't work in a hybrid way. Now, okay, some employers are insisting people go back to work full time, but I think that's relatively few. What's really at fault in this debate is a failure to recognise that the majority of women workers, and indeed male workers, cannot work from home. So people proclaim that work has changed, there is no going back, without pausing for a moment to recognise this only applies, in fact, to a minority of working women. The problem here, I'm not arguing here that women in white-collar and professional work don't need to be supported in seeking rights to work from home, but that we need to consider and even prioritise the needs and aspirations of those who are not able to do so. The real problem is that the gender equality agenda, in my view, is becoming more complex. It's both more about the specific experience of specific groups of women that are not directly comparable, and also more about the structural conditions of inequality. What I mean is how whole sectors and occupations are paid, not necessarily just about how people are treated within those sectors and occupations, which is where the equal pay legislation is focused. You can only effectively take an equal pay case if you've got an equal pay case within a firm, or if you had sectoral level bargaining, possibly at a sector level. In the public sector, you could perhaps take it at a wider level. This interest in the specific groups of women is, of course, associated with increased interest in the concepts that's called intersectionality, where the argument is that not only the experience of, for example, black women very different from white women, or working class women very different from middle class women, but you can't actually treat those as just sort of additive differences. They actually refer to completely different experiences in the labour market or in their own lives. So I think intersectionality has raised awareness that we can't just talk about women in general, and we have to unpack that. But structural factors are also becoming more significant in dividing women's opportunities. We've been moving away, when I was sort of entering the labour market, etc., from a general problem that women could not get the qualifications or opportunities for entry to higher level jobs. Maybe I should say something personal here. I was a student of economics in Cambridge when I was one of 7 women amongst 160 in 3 women's colleges compared to 20 men's colleges. So I've experienced this inequalities at that point. And in particular, women felt unable to remain in these jobs because, of course, when I started work, actually, rights to maternity leave had only just been introduced since I started work in 73, and they were only introduced in 75. And you only had a general right much later to maternity leave. And so most women were aware that if they wanted to combine work with family, they might actually have to leave their career job and settle for what I've called a little job, a lower level clerical or retail job, even for those, you know, if you like, with grammar school or higher education. It wasn't that people, it wasn't, if you like, working class women only who had to, if you like, take lower level jobs. Everybody was sort of at risk of occupational downgrading to some extent. There was a big study by Shirley Dex, sorry, I've forgotten the name of her co-author, Scott, but she did a study comparing the US and the UK, and this comes back to what I was saying about how the US had a better position for women. In the UK, everybody was downgrading their job when they had children, whereas in the US, they used to downgrade a little bit, but they could actually get back in at a higher level. But you could see that most women in Britain, up until the 60s, 70s, and later, were actually not able to sustain their careers, even if they did manage to get qualifications. But obviously, there are still problems for women in professional jobs, and I will return to those. But in the past, I would say the conditions of work in these lower paid occupations were potentially of concern to all women, as many were at risk of having to accept occupational downgrading and loss of access to careers if they wanted to combine work and family. Now that that position has improved for middle-class women, awareness and concern with what is happening to those women not in professional type work may be diminishing. I should at this point fully acknowledge that higher education is not in itself a route to eroding all aspects of class in your labour market opportunities. There has been research, not by myself, but showing that people, women who obtain higher education qualifications from a working class background have more difficulty in obtaining what's known as a graduate level job than women from a middle class background. So I'm using these terms slightly interchangeably, but I'm aware of the fact that this is an oversimplification. Nevertheless, many women still do not even enter higher education and are still employed in highly feminised, lower paid occupations, though these do not necessarily mean that they are low-value jobs in the wider sense. So this increasing divide in life chances among women means that we need to focus not just on the general problems women face, linked, for example, to the gender distribution of care responsibilities, though we still need to talk about that, and I will come back to it, but also to recognise that the challenges at the workplace and in relation to both the material rewards and the time demands from work are increasingly divergent between types of jobs and sectors. For some women, the issue of inequality may be primarily how they are treated within their occupational career relative to men. But for others, the problem is how we value the whole sector in which they are employed, a sector often dominated by women and associated with women's work. We thus, I would argue, need to have a gender and class-related approach to policy campaigns to make progress on gender equality. To provide some examples of how and why challenges by gender equality vary by social class, I'm going to draw now on some work I've been doing on job quality for women in middle-class type jobs and for women in working-class jobs. Now, class and occupational profile, I've already suggested, don't always coincide, but they're more likely to do so now that more advantaged women are able to maintain some foothold in their career jobs after childbirth through maternity leave and rights to request flexible working. So not necessarily mean that they have equality in those provisions, but they're not being ejected from them, or unless they perhaps try to do too much work full-time in an organisation where it's almost impossible to do that full-time job and maintain any involvement in children. But nevertheless, a lot of women are continuing in their careers. So I want to give you a flavour of these differences and what we can do to develop policies that target the specific problems women face in different social and economic environments. How can we combine campaigns for gender equality policies of benefit to all women that is from both working class and middle classes, with policies that are more targeted at the specific challenges that women face in these two types of jobs and life categories? And how can we prioritise the problems faced by the more disadvantaged women? As I've already suggested, this is a very oversimplified division, and I'm using it for illustrative purposes only. But I think by focusing on examples that apply primarily to middle class women or primarily to working class women, we can see how these challenges differ and the risk that public debate on gender equality may become dominated by middle class concerns. Even if you like, under COVID, there was this brief period when people did recognise that women who were poorly paid and work under poor conditions in many jobs, even when in jobs that were providing the basic needs for the society to function. Unfortunately, we then headed into a cost of living crisis, and that concern about how people were paid in these low-paid jobs tended to be subsumed by the problems of how does everybody make ends meet at the end of the month. So I'm going to give examples of the divergent challenges across 4 aspects of job quality and decent work, and indicate how we may need a differentiated and targeted set of policies to move forward. So let me start with pay, one of my key topics. So how do the major concerns over pay can differ between middle class and working class women? Well, there's been considerable research that shows that for many middle class women, particularly those working in, for example, finance and the private sector more widely, it's fairness in the distribution of bonuses and fairness in individualised pay awards, particularly when changing jobs, that really matter. If you get a different starting salary in a company than the man who's appointed at the same time as you, if you're a woman, you're very unlikely ever to earn the same amount of money as the man. The starting salaries matter more than almost anything. And also, much research by the EOC and other areas have shown that bonus distributions are incredibly skewed against women. For these kind of problems, I would argue that the Pay Transparency Directive that was passed by the EU after England, Scotland and Wales left the EU. I don't want to pronounce on whether you've left the EU or not. I'm sure that's too knotty a problem for this lecture. That kind of directive could help because employers under this Pay Transparency Directive have to explain the reasons for large organisational gender pay gaps and justify their pay strategies in light of equal pay principles. So if you're working in a finance sector and the distribution of bonuses is very skewed, then employers might be called to account for them. And this is potentially happening also in the UK now with the new Employment Rights Bill. But the details are not fully clear yet. I mean, they're out for consultation. I think it's important to recognise that the EU directive follows some states in America, like California, in requiring employers not to ask about previous salaries when hiring. That you shouldn't pay attention to what people have previously earned in making a job offer, and also in providing information about what the range of salaries are, so you have some idea about what you might want to be bargaining over. So those are the kinds of policies that might help in the middle-class women in the private sector. But it isn't the full story even for middle-class women, because actually the majority of women with degrees work in public services. Usually about 2/3 or 60% tend to enter public administration, health and education. And even if there are some parts of that for the private sector, they're dominated by people who are either working directly for the public sector or where their wages are influenced by the public sector. So nurses in the private sector will, the pay in the public sector will be shaping their opportunities in the private sector. And so it's public sector pay freezes that have been affecting those middle-class women of recent date. We can see that in the evidence of strikes of nurses, junior doctors, who are now mainly female, and teachers. And one thing you could get the government to do here is to agree not to link the valuation of public service professional work to macroeconomic factors that have nothing to do with the value of the job that they are doing. This could be included in the remit for pay review bodies, for example. Instead of that, the ability of the government to afford the pay increases is still a dominant factor, even though this means that because they're a monopsonist in many cases, the employers, they're dominating the market for teachers, nurses, doctors. There's nobody holding them to account for the fact that actually you end up with major vacancies and still the pay remains low, and nobody decides to actually increase the pay. Apart from in July, there were, as you're probably all aware, some increases in pay. I don't know whether that applied to Northern Ireland as well, but anyway. Now, if we turn to working class women, even those who are in the public services are not so affected by these pay freezes because their pay, to some extent, has to rise in line with the minimum wage. So, I mean, obviously some working class women will be, but it's the minimum wage that really matters to the working class women. And many are, in fact, paid so close to the minimum wage that they see little prospect of moving much beyond it. So what matters for these workers is guarantees of hours. It's not just about the hourly wage, but whether their hours are cut if the wage goes up or if they don't have enough hours in the first place. And also guarantees about the uprating of the minimum wage. And here again, you can see the role of directives in the EU in actually promoting the interests of women through the directive on adequate minimum wages that has set targets for what is adequate at the EU level. I mean, the UK has been following that to some extent, even though we're not actually under the EU. But this is a more important directive, and also included in that directive is some promotion of increasing in collective bargaining agreements that might be one way to deal with the second major problem for women in working class women, and that is the lack of any progression. There is one of the problems in many of these sectors that working class women are in is there's no recognition of skills and experience, no reward for moving on and moving their career forward in those professions. The pay remains very close to the minimum wage. When I was studying the social care sector back in 2007, 8, 9, and it's got worse since then, a senior care worker was offered 25 pence an hour more, or up to £1 an hour more, in return for which they had to agree to fill any gaps in the rota that they couldn't fill with persuading other people to do it. And most people turned them down because for up to £1 an hour more was not worth the increased uncertainty about having to work whenever there was a gap in the rota. So it's that kind of thing that is of greater concern to working class women. And again, maybe if we're thinking about what the new government has been bringing in new employment rights, one of the things is potential sector-level pay bargaining for social care workers. Now, that's been under discussion in Scotland. And in Germany, they've, since COVID, have introduced a new collective agreement that now has a very significant pay differential for skilled workers. Okay, that's easier to manage in Germany because they have much more regulated training systems, and you can work out who is a skilled worker and who isn't, and that is a factor that makes it easier because we tend not to have such a formal system of recognizing who's apprenticed, who's not, etc. But nevertheless, we can see that you can do something different, and the things that you want to do for those women are very different from the things you want to do for those who are facing discrimination in the distribution of bonuses in the finance sector. So that's the first thing I was going to look at. The second was training and skill development opportunities, which is quite linked to what I've just been saying. One of the problems for middle-class women who opt to reduce their hours or to work from home may be that they feel that they get excluded from opportunities to do challenging work or opportunities to take on high-profile clients, which thereby restricts their opportunities to develop their skills and be candidates for promotion. They feel trapped in jobs without opportunities for development, particularly if they can't, if you like, take their any rights or any negotiated agreements on reduced hours to other employers. Now, that is something that is already in the process of being implemented, that the previous government has agreed to drop the 6-month qualifying requirement before you could request a right to flexible working. You can now request from day one. I'm not clear, however, that will help that much, because they rejected the idea that employers had to advertise whether they were open to flexible working from day one. Having to wait till you've got the job before you can then request it seems to me to be problematic. And I think it would have been better if there'd been a requirement that if they already offered flexible working for most people, that it should be in the advert that was available, and that would empower women trapped in these jobs that are not offering opportunities to work, to apply for these jobs and feel that they could expect to have not necessarily identical, but some similar consideration of their needs for flexibility if they would be the chosen candidate. So that's I think other things you could do for middle-class women, though, who are feeling trapped, is do something more about the enforcement of age discrimination legislation. It's still the case that women who return to work after having children find themselves trapped in jobs that aren't going anywhere. They still may find it difficult to get a job in a new career, kickstart a second chance career, because we don't really enforce age discrimination legislation. There's still an expectation that people should be new graduates going into a training job, not women returning after childbirth, even though it is in the law. And likewise, I don't think we've really implemented the directive that is in UK law on equal treatment for part-timers, that they should be treated the same as full-timers. It's seen as perfectly normal to remove the right to work with high-level clients from part-timers because they're not there all the time and we can't disturb the clients. The possibility of having teamwork whereby the part-timer can work with a full-timer or more than one part-timer, so the client will always have somebody they know to turn to, is often an option that's not considered by employers. So I think all of these legislation is not being effectively implemented, and so we could go back to those and look for the campaign on that. Nevertheless, these measures are likely to be much more limited effectiveness for working class women, as their existing skills in work may not be recognised or rewarded. This may be becoming an obvious theme of my talk. And the key issue, as I've already said, a key issue is why are care workers paid at or close to the minimum wage with limited or no rewards for skills and experience? Also, training, particularly for those on short hours contracts, may not be available in paid working time and may have to be done in own time, especially if it's online training. This doesn't mean there's no need for more training opportunities, both for full-time and full and part-timers within their current work in jobs that are mainly done by women from the working class. But the skills developed must lead to genuine opportunities to progress, because otherwise having to do training is just an extra chore. If it doesn't lead to anything, then it's seen as problematic. Again, new sector-level bargaining on pay and skill in sectors such as social care could help. But I also think working-class women would also potentially benefit from expanded opportunities to be supported in extending their education and or retraining when unemployed or returning to the labour market. This is common in many European countries. If you're unemployed, you can do a training course in order to change careers, restart your careers. But the UK has had this work first policy where you have to get a job, and very unsupportive of people who want to train. So what about issues of working time and enabling women to have a full life beyond work? So working time is a really important issue. For middle-class women, most of whom will be in salaried work, I think the key issue with them is whether they can or should meet employer expectations of being willing to work unpaid overtime, and often at an extensive level. This is particularly a problem when women opt for reduced hours. In some of my research with professional workers, People have said, well, I've worked 4 days a week in order that I can do the other work that I'm expected to do on the Friday, and so I can at least have the weekend off. So people reduce their hours in order not to have to work weekends, rather than reduce their hours in order to have Friday free. Research by Hye-Jung Chung, now at King's, has unveiled what's known as the flexibility paradox, namely that women sort of believe that they must show gratitude if they are allowed to work flexibly, if they're allowed to work from home, if there's any opportunity to change the schedule and work in the evenings if they have to go and pick the kids up if they're ill or whatever. And the result is they work more hours in return for this flexibility. So women themselves have become overworked. So for middle-class women, the key improvements could be in areas such as limiting unpaid overtime. We could consider abolishing the opt-out from the 48-hour maximum working week as a starting point. We could introduce rights to disconnect, rights to work remotely or for hybrid working, so you don't have to feel grateful about it. And indeed, embrace the shorter full-time hours movement, the 4-day week. I have some problems with that proposal. I think it's not sufficiently gendered, but I think it's nevertheless something that we should be thinking about as a long-term goal, because unless everybody worked, both men and women, if you like, more like 30 hours a week, sharing care becomes problematic. I think the shorter working hours should be seen as a gender goal. At the moment, I think it's not focused sufficiently on that. For working class women, their main problems are often those of unpredictable schedules and pressure to accept any extra shifts for fear of being excluded from the next round of offers. They also face the high costs of childcare to cover fluctuating work schedules, and most working class women really can't afford to engage in formal childcare. And they may not even be able to plan their lives, plan holidays, due to fear of missing shifts or not having sufficient guaranteed income to book in advance. Their policy priorities may thus be for higher guaranteed hours, advance notice of changes to schedules, and both of those are mooted in the current new employment rights legislation. Reduced use of split shifts and more rights to take holidays according to employee preferences. Finally, the fourth thing I'm going to look at was voice and access to employment rights. And here we have a situation where middle-class women are more likely to work in organisations where there's a formal commitment to equality policies. But as we know from all the publicity in the paper about major problems at work, it's no guarantee that will protect them against working in a toxic work culture. Also, many middle-class women who are now choosing to work remotely or in reduced hours may be concerned about invisibility at the workplace and experience difficulties in expressing their concerns. While for working-class women, a key issue may be not even qualifying for the rights that other workers have. For example, sick pay. They may not work enough hours to get sick pay. If they're on a flexible contract, employers can reduce their hours in the run-up to maternity leave and find that they don't have access to maternity leave. Those on short hours contracts may not interact sufficiently with management to feel able to express their voice. That management-worker dialogue that's supposedly so important in non-union firms may be not really feasible for those who are working very short hours in a very fragmented way. And they may also fear not being offered extra shifts if they do voice their concerns. So there's that fear factor as well. So there would be likely to be benefits for both middle class and working class women from measures to reduce harassment at work, the toxic work culture, especially as is now being mooted. Employers have more responsibility to ensure that people are not harassed by third-party clients. This is a particular problem for working class women in areas like hospitality, where if it's the client who's doing the harassing, the employer up to now can just say, well, that's nothing to do with me, but they may have to take more responsibility in future. And there are also marginalised groups in both sets of jobs, whether remote workers or those on casual contracts, and we need to make more efforts to make workplaces more inclusive. We need, as is happening, more universal rights from day one, for example, to unfair dismissal, as well as to flexible working, and rights that are not linked to employment records, and that would be of most use to working class women. But what we also need to do is improve the level of benefits. It's not just having the right, but also the level of benefits. Sick pay in the UK is currently lower than anywhere in the rest of Europe apart from Malta. What I'm suggesting here is that these divergent job quality challenges suggest different priorities and approaches to address the specific problems faced by women from different social classes in the UK. I would argue that these problems have been exacerbated by a very deregulated labour market in the UK, though the new Employment Rights Bill may be changing some aspects of this deregulation. But it is also exacerbated by the impoverished universal welfare rights, all set at extremely low levels by international standards. Nevertheless, I think that all countries there will be differences by class, and this should be something that's given more attention wherever you are. But by focusing on job quality, you might say, well, I've left to one side what some would regard the elephant in the room, and that is the care responsibilities that all women face. And policies to address that issue are clearly of benefit to both working class and middle class women. All women need policies to support their care responsibilities and to try to redistribute care to men. But I would argue that even these need looking at from a class perspective. In the UK context, more subsidised childcare could benefit everybody, and the recent moves towards more free childcare for under threes is clearly a move in the right direction. But we all know that the actual degree of funding is insufficient, and therefore there are hidden costs with this supposed free childcare, and it's likely that working class women will take up this offer much less frequently than the middle class women. Similarly, better paid maternity leave could benefit both groups, but it matters whether we're talking about state-based mandatory maternity and parental paid leave, or we're talking about occupational level, because apart from working class women who get jobs in the public sector, they're much less likely to have access to those kinds of improvements. So yes, we need to make progress in changing support for care and in the social norms surrounding responsibility for care. But these policies do need to be designed with all women in mind. And we also need policies to help women in specific problems they encounter in their different types of jobs. So I want to leave you now with three main messages. First, gender equality is far from sorted. Instead, we are entering a new phase where the specific problems facing groups of women are becoming more diverse and require a wide range of policies. We need to address these divergent needs, but also find a way to prioritise the interests of the most disadvantaged and those who are unlikely to be able to move up the job ladder, whatever the progress in breaking down gender barriers. And that brings me directly to the second point. The most urgent need, in my view, is to revalue the jobs women do and not only focus on moving them on. And that actually applies both in public sector professions that women have moved into and the lower level jobs such as social care and retail and cleaning and all these kind of things. If we want gender equality to contribute and not work against overall levels of inequality, we need to focus on wider measures that reduce penalties for working in particular sectors, occupations, and on specific contracts, and not only focus on gender gaps per se. And the third point is really to be very sceptical about discussions about changes in gender pay gaps where people say, oh, nothing's changed because it hasn't gone up very much, or it's going to be very slow progress at this rate of progress. If you actually dig down into these gender pay gap trends, it's probably some women benefiting and other women losing. So you're actually getting counteractive changes that are netting each other out and ending up with apparently stability. I think that is not what we've experienced over the last few decades. We haven't experienced stability for women. We've actually experienced divergent trends. And we need to recognise that and recognise that progress to gender equality is not linear. It's not going to happen smoothly over so many years. It's not going to affect all women equally. We need to recognise that we need to dig down and find those differences. So, and I would argue that in measuring progress, we need to pay as much attention to changes in real incomes and in real conditions at work, and not only concerned with improvements relative to men, as this can be associated with an overall hollowing out of protections in employment for all. And I would argue that the a feminist approach to gender equality is about being more inclusive, and that means about maintaining and improving protections and not about hollowing them out. So we don't just need to compare to men, we also need to make certain that we're not encouraging, if you like, a sort of policy that might say lead to pay cuts for men in low-paid jobs simply to fund women's equality. We need to actually argue what we need is better funding for those sectors and those areas of work. So on that point, I will leave it there. Thanks very much.
Okay, Jill, first of all, can I thank you for an immense contribution tonight. I certainly wasn't wrong when I said I could think of no better person. I think that's one of the best lectures we have had. The sheer breadth and depth of the critique that you gave has really been stimulating. We have about 10 to 15 minutes for some questions from the floor. So are there any burning questions? Or I'm very happy to start with one, but is there any burning questions? Just get us started. Right, we'll start with Rini. The microphone's coming just for the recording.
Thank you very much, Jill, for broadening it out so much. And as you were speaking, I was thinking a bit about the whole SWAN agenda. And I suppose in some ways the SWAN agenda is very much oriented towards middle-class women. It started with academics. It's kind of gradually accommodating a broader sector, but still there are people working in the university who would count as very different kinds of agendas. And although they're included in things like pay audits and stuff like that, I think SWAN probably hasn't really paid attention to that. So I just wondered, I know in the last couple of years SWAN started to think a lot about gender and things like that. But I think what you're saying really is maybe they ought to have been thinking a bit more about looking at the whole institution and not just the legitimate issues that those of us who are sort of in the more middle class occupations have had. So that's really all I wanted to ask you.
And maybe can I just add to that, because I think we've seen across universities a trend to outsource many of those services, such as your cleaning. Does that have a bearing as well in terms of the institutional responsibility around gender equality?
Well, yeah, I mean, I happen to know that actually the university gender pay gaps are quite variable according to whether they've outsourced or not outsourced. But interestingly, I'm not quite certain of the details here. The new Employment Rights Bill is talking about the gender pay gap reporting having to include outsourced services. So that would reveal, or it would make it more comparable. I mean, it is ridiculous to hear people saying, well, the best sector to be in if you're a woman is accommodation and hospitality because they have the lowest gender pay gap. That's only because it's mainly women, but even when the men are there, they're also working on really bad jobs and bad pay. So that's partly, this is where this sort of focus comes from. People are not really thinking about the fact that that whole sector is low paid. They're thinking about what's happening within the sector. And I think that's where the problems lie. It's not clear to me necessarily that universities can do that much about, what cleaners are paid or catering workers are paid. That is a wider sectoral thing. It will probably need that sectoral level collective bargaining to boost pay for those primarily, and then it would have a spin-over effects into the universities. But nevertheless, the fact they could be ignored, and that some people have even argued universities actually have outsourced some of these services to make themselves look better, is a concern.
Yes.
There is probably a bit of a follow-up then to that question, because I suppose I work in a service industry where we bid continuously for these sectors, and I suppose it then abdicates responsibility from HR, who are the ones that are responsible for auditing gender pay gaps and equality, and takes it into the hands of procurement, where it becomes a completely auditory, and they're going, and much as it's phrased as most economically advantageous to the organisation, who are standing over huge EDI principles and saying this is what we're doing. Ultimately it comes down to then who is the lower bidder, and when it comes to those services as catering, hospitality, cleaning services, laundry, etc., you're then as an organisation reinforcing. And I suppose how do we bring it, how do we move it forward so that it's actually those conversations that are being had at the C-suite by the finance directors and not just by the HR directors?
I think that's a very good point. I mean, there are some moves again in the current proposals to bring in public, to enable public procurement to take into account whether or not jobs are decent jobs, if you like. And that certainly happened. I mean, Scotland has got in social care requirement that the real living wage should be paid and things like that. But it is fairly small scale, So, I mean, people are, that is how I mean, I know that is what happened with social care in England. I mean, I don't know whether people know the background here, that there was a new grading structure. I was actually involved in this new grading structure right back in the 1980s. They brought in the first time they tried to do it, they brought in a new grading job evaluation structure. And in fact, the local authorities sacked the consultants because they were not really following the new grading structure, and brought in a load of academics to do it, including myself. But actually, that didn't get very far. It did improve the grading of care workers, but then later there was a big re-evaluation of the whole of the local authority grading structure. And care workers were rated above, refuse collectors, etc., and then almost immediately afterwards, there was a big increase in outsourcing where they were just paid minimum wage. So instead of getting a pay rise. But, it's not, you could blame the local authorities for doing that. But actually, if you actually interrogated their finances, they weren't really being funded for that equal pay thing. So that's really one of the problems, that when we brought in equal pay, within the public sector, they didn't fund that, so you did encourage a lot of outsourcing as a result.
Okay, next question.
Thank you very much. I'm just wondering, in terms of when you look at the migrant workers coming into the system, they play quite a significant role as well, especially in the context of migrant workers working at the bottom end of that scale. How do you provide the policy options? And I'm dealing with that in the context of policy, especially in the context in the place in India, where we have this huge challenge of guest workers, the label as guest workers, but the challenge is that there is a statutory payment available, and again, the lack of funding is a big challenge.
I mean, I'm not suggesting anything I'm talking about is easy, and it hasn't been achieved, anywhere. But my own experience, I could just give you an example of, I did do a study for the Equal Opportunities Commission back in, I can't remember now, about 10, 15, 12 years ago, and with other colleagues, and we were looking at cleaners. And it was really quite extraordinary how HR managers would justify the fact that they had moved everybody from regular contracts onto 0 hours contracts. They would say things to me. It was an HR manager of quite a large hotel chain, and I was asking, why is everybody in this hotel on a 0 hours contract? And their argument was, well, it's unfair if they're all doing the same job for somebody to be on a regular contract. Everybody has to be on the same contract. And I think one of the problems is we've had, so you can say it's the migrant workers undercutting, but it's also the HR managers, if you like, finding a new rationale as to why. You could make the same thing in universities. Should everybody be on fixed-term contracts because some people are, you know, is that the way forward? Should we have to be constantly competing for our own jobs, etc.? So the model put forward was, you know, we've got, everybody's got to be equal in that sense, and that's one of the, it's interesting how equality can be misused in interesting ways. So I think I agree with you that many migrant workers, because of lack of opportunities, would be willing to work for different pay and conditions than non-migrant workers, but it's the employers that, in a way, need to take the responsibility. I think, you know, I mean, you know, rather than saying it's the migrant workers, it's the.
Okay. Further questions? Yes, Bibek.
Thank you. My question is about equality, not necessarily about gender equality, but equality in general that we hear so often about. So when we talk or hear about equality, is it the equality of opportunity, or is it the equality of outcome, or is it both?
I think the argument I was trying to make is that actually these things are, that I'm interested in the overall equality of the labour market. What's the gap between the bottom and the top, if you like? And I think if you focus on that, the two things sort of may come together. I mean, the equality of outcome the equality of opportunity matters less in some ways, as long as the penalty for not having succeeded is lower. So you've got some benefits anyway for people who don't get the equality of opportunity. And the equality of outcome is likely to be greater because there's a narrower gap. So I think I'm interested in changing the structure of opportunities, if you like, not just about equality of opportunities versus equality of outcomes. I mean, I'm not arguing that everything should be totally equal. I mean, I'm arguing. I think there is other problems here. I mean, I think the labour market is a very complex thing, and we have to think about it in many different ways. On the one hand, I think the floor to the labour market must have some connection to cost of living and people's ability to live. But I do think that jobs have to be evaluated by their value to the company, to the society, but also how provide some opportunities for people to progress and move up some kind of ladder, which shouldn't necessarily require them to leave that particular job area and go somewhere else, which is what happens if you're in many areas in these low-paid services. There's no real way to make a career in those services. So I'm saying you've got a little bit mixture of all these different things mixed in, and it's not one or the other. But the first important thing is not to have too much inequality in the whole labour market, because that creates a major problem. And it also creates a problem of what's called assortative mating, which I don't like that term, but it's where, if you like, people in graduate jobs, men in graduate jobs will tend to marry women in graduate jobs. And if we don't pay attention to inequalities, you've got two high-level jobs in a household, and then you've got two low-level jobs in a household if working-class men tend to marry working-class women. And so I think you do have to move towards a more equal overall structure of wages in order to have not a widening inequality across households. And I'm not here arguing that women shouldn't earn the same as men, because men, the household should dominate and they should just take a low salary because their husbands better pay. That's not what I'm arguing, but I just think if you're thinking about the overall transition towards a more gender equal society, I think you need to move both to shorter working hours and to lower inequality between the top and the bottom.
Okay, we're beginning to run out of time here. Can I just pick up on something, Jill? You referenced your own experience in the 70s, and that didn't sound great. And it sounds like, we have made progress, and yet, it'd be very easy to leave here tonight and be almost overwhelmed with the challenges around getting some sort of gender equality. And it reminds me of the quote by C.S. Lewis, "There are far, far better things ahead than any we leave behind. And is that your sense? What are your reflections on that? Do you think we are moving in the right direction?
I think we're moving in the right direction probably for middle-class women, but I'm not so convinced we are for working-class women. I think that would be my concern. I'm also not, I mainly look at issues of pay, working time, the more material aspects of work. I think all of us are sort of pretty horrified by the amount of frequency with which we have other scandals about harassment and abuse. So I don't think that's moving in the right direction. So although I know it's difficult to differentiate between willingness to talk about something and whether it happened in the past, but I don't think we've got a uniform progress, but it doesn't mean that things haven't changed. I think that's what I was, really wanting to say, is that some people benefit and others lose, and some people benefit on some directions, but they may find themselves working in very stressful conditions and toxic work environments, so they may not, in terms of health and well-being, might not be benefiting from their material success. I certainly think in certain areas, it is, academia, I think it is much easier. I should say I was the first female professor in the whole University of UMIST when I was there. So that was a science and technology university, so it was a bit behind. It was a bit late to have the first female professor. So I'm fully aware of those, the problems there, but that has eased, and I don't, so that is good news, but there are these other sides to it.
Okay, I think time has probably beat us at this point. So again, I want to thank Jill, but Professor Kieran Connolly is going to come and do our closing remarks.
Okay, thank you, Nola. My name's Kieran Connolly. I'm Deputy Head of the Queen's Business School. And so good evening, everyone. And thank you, Professor Rubery, for first of all taking the time to travel to Belfast and also to give the annual Mary McAleese Diversity Lecture. Professor Rubery, your insights this evening into gender equality, or maybe inequality, have really shed a light on critical issues that resonate not just in academic circles but in society at large. The clarity with which you have presented the challenges and hopefully the opportunities in achieving gender equality remind us why you're such a highly regarded figure in this field. It's also fitting that this evening's lecture bears the name of Mary McAleese, whose legacy of compassion and commitment to equality aligns so well with everything that you've done in your career. And as we reflect on your wisdom that you've passed on this evening and your lecture, we're reminded that equality is not just an aspiration. It's essential component of progress. We in Queen's Business School, we're proud of the fact that we're one of the most diverse schools in the university, with roughly 2/3 of our academic colleagues recruited from outside the UK. However, while female representation is improving, it's definitely an area where further progress is needed, especially among the professoriate. And this is an issue that we as a school are attempting to address, and I'm happy to say that we are making some progress, but certainly we're not there yet. And just before I finish, if you could indulge me with 1 minute, just with a very personal story that to me signifies the high esteem with which we hold Mary McAleese, and also the importance of lectures like tonight, particularly with Mary McAleese's name being attached to it. A year ago tomorrow, my father-in-law passed away, and 20 years ago, Mary McAleese launched a book that he had written on the history of the Redemptorists and Clonard Monastery. For 20 years, that was the proudest moment of his life, and he quite literally dined out for 20 years on Mary McAleese launching his book, to the extent he spent the last 4 or 5 months in a care home, and he had 2 pictures in his room. One, thankfully, with his wife and my mother-in-law, but the other one with Mary McAleese and him at the book launch. So to me, tonight being here is very poignant, and it also signifies just the importance of Mary McAleese and you being here as well. So first of all, just to wrap up then, I'd like to thank you everyone for attending this evening's lecture. I'd like to have a special thanks to Grace for all the work that she's done in putting it together, and for all the staff at Riddle Hall. And also to Rini, who is someone that I always associate with starting the Mary McAleese lecture and been, well, at the forefront of promoting this in the school. So again, and it's great to see you here, Rini. And finally, again, thank you, Professor Rubery, for tonight.